Bert, I'm fascinated with metaphysics because it purports to be able to tell us how we can really understand what reality is. And I've been talking to many analytic philosophers who have their approach to the nature of metaphysics and reality, and they would tend to dismiss phenomenology as something that's not relevant, that doesn't really help us to understand metaphysics. What I need to do is to understand phenomenology better.
Okay, you understand phenomenology, then the realism issue is a tough one. But let's just start with what phenomenology sort of inherits and has to get out of, and which I think, and Heidegger would say, the analytic tradition is still stuck in. I was just teaching this yesterday. Heidegger teaching in 1925, railing against the idea that there's a problem of the external world, there's a problem of other minds, there's a problem of whether reality depends on us or is independent of us. He thinks they're all false problems, and he says you get an industry of philosophers constantly trying to solve them, getting jobs and refuting each other, but they starting from the wrong place. What's the wrong place? Well, the wrong place is Descartes. He is the villain for the... Whereas Plato is the big villain for the certain Kierkegaardian kind of existentialist. But for a philosopher, then it's Descartes. And what did Descartes do? He had the idea that we were self-sufficient subjects. He introduced the idea that we were subjects, that a subject before that was anything, a substance, and the substance was anything like the flower pot that was stable and had properties. But then he turned it around and said that we are a kind of being, what he called a thinking thing, what somebody like John Searle would now call mind, when he talks about mind to world, direction of fit, and world to mind. And there's only two things in his ontology, two ways of being. You be a mind, self-contained, with ideas in it, and intentional content, to use this jargon. The giveaway is content. It's all inside the mind. And then there's on the other side the world. In Descartes' physics, it was bits of extended matter, the extended thing. And the question is how you get these two things together. They're both totally real, but there's a big problem about how this one, the thinking one, gets to know anything about the substance out there, which is self-sufficient stuff. Right. And they go round and round, and the last round is Husserl, before Heidegger comes along. He makes a big breakthrough, and at least he says, well, let's just describe the phenomena and not keep talking about these two realms of being and how they're related to each other. Unfortunately, he's still totally trapped in Descartes. He thinks that on the one hand there is what he calls transcendental subjectivity, but that's still a kind of self-contained mental activity, and on the other hand there's the world out there, and Husserl finds himself turning into some kind of idealist, in which and just another move in the game in which all this mental stuff organizes experience into this experience of reality, but it's really all mental through and through. Kant made this kind of move. Leibniz, in another way, made this kind of move. So Heidegger is really criticizing Husserl to Husserl's students in 1925 when he's saying, because Husserl thinks he has to solve the problem of other minds. If all I've got access to is my inner experiences, how do I ever know that you're not just a robot, Descartes says? How do I know you even got inner experiences? And how in the world would I know what they were? Yours are private to you, mine are private to me. And so Heidegger's saying, well, Husserl's falling into that and trying to get out of it, and you can't get out of it. You never should have bought that ontology. Ontology means a story about being, and the story about being is there's just two kinds of being, mental being and physical, material being.
And this is what Heidegger wants to destroy.
Yes, Heidegger has to get out of it. Husserl's still trapped in it. And
yet Husserl develops phenomenology, but he's still trapped in Descartes' dualism.
Yes, right. He's trapped inside, and his way out of the dualism is to make it a monism of mind. It's all done. All experience is organized by transcendental consciousness. That is, the mind giving meaning to everything.
Which moves him to being an idealist.
Yes. And Heidegger just thinks the whole thing is wrong. How would you go about showing that this way of thinking that's dominated Western thinking totally Well, for even the people who disagree with it in its terms somehow. And Heidegger just going to trash it, break with it. So the first level, and the one that I like best, is Heidegger's notion of how we relate to the stuff in the world. And Heidegger says we deal with it. My word is cope with it, but my students just told me this week that coping sounds like it's difficult, like you have to cope with Alzheimer's or something. Yeah. And I don't mean that at all. I mean just the opposite. Heidegger means just the opposite. When you deal with it, you deal with the way you deal. His examples are always simple and down to earth. He says when you go out the door, you use the latch. That means you don't have to think about the latch. You don't have the goal of going out the door. You don't have to figure out that you use the latch. It's all in flow. So Heidegger makes this brilliant move of getting beneath the kind of experience which is where John Searle still is, for instance, which is close to Husserl. You're trying to do things. You've got a visual experience of things. All this is still inner stuff. And then that causes you to have bodily movements. This is how Searle and Descartes would think about it. And that's physical stuff. And how they get together is a big deal causal problem. Yeah. But Heidegger thinks that you can go beneath that to what I'm calling absorbed coping, which is this dealing. And when you're absorbedly coping, then you are in flow most of the time, like an athlete who is lost. You can lose total awareness of what you're doing. When you don't need to figure out that you want to go out of the door and how to go out of the door. You're just talking to somebody about philosophy, Heidegger says, and you enter the classroom, and you must have somehow taken account of the door and the doorknob, but nothing like having visual experiences and stuff and intentional content directed toward the doorknob. Just act in flow. So at the basic level,
it's being in the world.
Yes, that's it. At the basic level, we are just dealing with things, and Heidegger calls that being in the world. And in that being in the world, you overcome, you cut beneath, really. I keep telling the class, I like to give my course the hour after Searle gives his course. We've done this for years. I think it must be a mind-boggling experience. He tells them about the inner and the outer, the mind and the external world. I tell them there is no inner and outer. There is no mind and external world. There's just absorbed coping. That's being in the world with hyphens. And then the students will have to figure out who to believe. But that's the first move. Then there are about 5 different moves that Heidegger makes against the subject-object distinction. The next one is to say that we're the kind of being that has to take a stand on its own being. Now, it sounds like very metaphysical talk, but it's not like talking about the self-sufficient mind and the self-sufficient stuff out there. He says there are 3 kinds of being in Heidegger. There's the being that things have when we're using them as equipment and coping using them. The doorknob's being is what Heidegger calls readiness to hand. There's the kind of being that objects have, which he calls presence at hand. And then there's a kind of being we have, which he calls Dasein, which is being there. And that kind of being has to take a stand on its being. There you see the Kierkegaard in the background. They're really called to have an unconditional commitment and to understand who they are. But the only way they can understand who they are is by dealing with things. So if you're a teacher, you've got to have blackboards and students and books and so forth. You can't. So again, the problem of the subject and the object disappears. I need the, quote, external world to be me. But then it's no longer the external world. It's this whole organized bunch of objects with other people who are students and interviewers and so forth. And all of that in order to get rid of the subject-object distinction. So finally, metaphysics gets switched around by a phenomenologist into a description of this ground level where the idea of inner and outer, subject and object doesn't even come up, and then you have being in the world, and you can start out in a whole new direction. That's Heidegger.